And welcome to everyone who is there physically on campus at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and to our continuing to grow group of folks who are joining us online. Today is our 2023 Presler Lecture, and we are exceptionally pleased that you're joining us in whatever capacity that is, and especially our Presler family who have supported this lecture series. We're delighted and honored today to welcome Dr. Joy Ladin with us, and you'll hear more about Dr. Ladin momentarily, but I will continue to say I am just thrilled that Dr. Ladin is with us. We have the opportunity to have a great conversation today, to be challenged intellectually, spiritually, and for us to do something with that as we leave. And I'll say, as the new president here at Louisville Seminary, that is the type of thing that I am so very passionate about and delighted to be surrounded by here in our community. Thank you all for taking the time to be kind to one another, to listen to one another, and to continue to grow. Before we get started, I think it's appropriate for us to be reminded again about this exceptional lectureship that we have. The Henry H. and Marion A. Presler Lectureship was established in order to honor the couple's missionary service and to inspire the Louisville community and its wider community about issues of global mission and the role of American denominations in their historical and present witness to that mission. The topics of the lectures vary, and they have throughout the years, but the overall theme is Jesus' commission to the church in Matthew 28:19 through 20, to go, therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Dr. Henry Presler studied for 2 years at Louisville Seminary and then transferred to Boston University School of Theology. In his later years, he remembered his formative time at Louisville Seminary and left a bequest for this lectureship. We're all thankful for all of those who've gone before us to give us this opportunity, and let us be challenged to then take the tools that we inherit and use them for good, use them for grace, and use them to build community. I'd invite you, as we start this, to pause and take a moment to reflect, to offer our prayers and thanksgiving, and to prepare for this very special time together. Please join me as you feel comfortable as I lead us in prayer. Gracious God, the conversations that we have, the relationships that we build, the moments that we share, they are not only part of our experience, but they help develop the narrative all around us that will be shared about who we are and what we are called to do, to be, to think, to feel, and to show to one another. Today, as we are truly blessed by the words of Dr. Ladin, I encourage all of us to pause and to hear what we are called to do with the words that we share with one another. Bless this time and truly help us to be a people of peace, a people of hope, and a people of love. We pray with this in mind. Amen. At this time, I'd like to welcome officially our Dean of the Faculty, Dr. Deborah Mumford, to introduce Dr. Ladin. Deborah?
All right, thank you so much. It is a pleasure for me to be here and for us to welcome into our midst Dr. Joy Ladin. She is the 2023 Presler Lecturer. Dr. Ladin is an American poet and a former David and Ruth Gottsman Chair of English at Stern College for Women at Yeshiva University. She was the first openly transgender professor at an Orthodox Jewish institution. Dr. Ladin earned her PhD in American Literature from Princeton University, a Master's in Fine Arts from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and a BA from Sarah Lawrence College. She is taught at Tel Aviv University as a Fulbright Scholar and at Sarah Lawrence College as a visiting professor. She also taught at Yeshiva University for more than 15 years. Dr. Ladin is the author of numerous books, including 9 books of poetry, whose titles include The Future is Trying to Tell Us Something, Fireworks in the Graveyard, and Impersonation. In 2012, Dr. Ladin published the memoir Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders. In the book, she asserts that she is an old-fashioned, a garden variety transsexual, rather than a postmodernist shapeshifter. Her memoir describes her life, her transition, and her religious faith. In 2018, Dr. Ladin published her first full-length academic monograph, The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective. Her book offers trans readings of the Torah in order to argue that, despite traditional readings of Genesis and other biblical stories, as enforcing a strict dichotomy between men and women, she asserts that God is not particularly interested or invested in gender or the gender binary per se. There are few people in the world better suited than Dr. Ladin to help us today to strategize about how to combat anti-trans theology. The title of her lecture this afternoon is Miracles and Strangers, Responding to the Spread of Anti-Trans Theology. She will share ways to respond to these toxic theologies in religious communities, theologies that not only exclude people who don't fit binary gender categories of male and female, but that demonize them and all who love and support them. Dr. Ladin, Joy, we are delighted to have you with us. Let us welcome Dr. Joy Ladin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monkford. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. As I was telling you, I've been working day and night on this. It feels like a very important thing, and I'm grateful to everybody who is here to listen. I'm gonna read for too long, I'm sure, but I'm hoping that after that we'll be able to have a real conversation. So I'm going to dive in. These days, anti-trans theologies are the loudest voices speaking to religious conservatives about how to respond to identities that don't fit binary gender categories. Categories they see as having been established when, according to their readings of Genesis, God created human beings to be either and only male or female. Because trans and non-binary identities conflict with this idea of gender, anti-trans theologies present them as existential threats to religious traditions and communities and to the divine human relationship itself, feeding fears that conservatives are translating into anti-trans laws. And because most inclusive theologies don't talk much about the conflicts between trans and non-binary identities and religious versions of binary gender, anti-trans theologies are often the only voices addressing how conservatives should respond to those conflicts. Theology and theologians alone can't overturn anti-trans legislation. That takes political organization and action. But theology that responds directly to the questions trans and non-binary identities raise for religious conservatives can help them recognize that the texts and traditions they see as sacred offer better ways to understand and respond to these identities than the fear and rejection promoted by anti-trans theologies. The success of anti-trans theologies in framing trans and non-binary identities as threats means it won't be easy for us to craft alternatives religious conservatives find persuasive. To do so, we need to understand what anti-trans theologies can tell us about the conflicts and fears driving religious conservatives. That's why I'm going to ask you to pay close attention to language many of us may find offensive and triggering. Hard as that may be, I believe that anti-trans theologies can teach us to address conservatives' concerns about trans and non-binary identities in ways that help them realize that their own religious traditions offer capacious, compassionate, and faith-strengthening ways to respond to them. I first encountered anti-trans theology in fall 2008, when, after a year of being banned from campus in response to my gender transition, I returned to teaching English at Orthodox Jewish Yeshiva University and became the first openly trans person in the Orthodox world, and the first that my students and most Orthodox Jews had ever heard of. Though I'd already experienced phobic, hurtful, secular reactions to my transition, I didn't encounter anti-trans theology until I read what Rabbi Moshe Tendler, a senior dean of the university's rabbinical school and nationally known professor of Jewish medical ethics and biology, said to the New York Post, which saw my return as page 3 news. And, no, a second. I think I can share. Yeah. So this is what Rabbi Tendler said. He's not a woman, he's a male with enlarged breasts. He's a person who represents a kind of amorality which runs counter to everything Yeshiva University stands for. There is just no leeway in Jewish law for a transsexual. There's no niche where he can hide out as a female without being in massive violation of Torah law, Torah ethics, and Torah morality. Rabbi Tendler doubled down in the national LGBTQ publication, The Advocate, saying, we're dealing with someone who is severely psychologically disturbed, and we should physically restrain him from touching his body the way we would an anorexic teenager. Transsexuality in the Torah is absolutely forbidden. I now see these comments as early, unsophisticated versions of anti-trans theology, theology that rejects the reality of trans and non-binary identities and insists that religious texts and traditions such as the Torah condemn and demand condemnation of people like me who embrace them. All traditional versions of binary gender hold that human beings are essentially and unchangeably male or female, depending on the bodies we're born into. But conservative religious versions see binary gender not only as a matter of biology, that is, as determined by physical sex, but as having been divinely established when, as Genesis 1:27 says, God created human beings, male and female. From this perspective, binary gender reflects God's will and is built into the divine order of creation. And because Genesis doesn't mention any other creatures that were all created male and female, it also signifies God's special relationship with humanity, the creation of human beings in God's image. That's why religious conservatives see it as crucial that each of us accepts the sex we're born into and the gender roles religious traditions assign us. They worry that people like me who reject binary identities are rejecting not just human biology or social conventions, but God, religion, and the image of God in which we're created. As those who practice inclusive theology know, this is not the only way to understand gender as a sign and expression of the divine human relationship. We can also see gender identities, binary and otherwise, as ways of expressing who we know God made us to be, ways to fulfill religious principles such as honesty and authenticity, demonstrations of God's boundless and ongoing creativity, and as revelations of the myriad ways God's incomprehensible image can be manifest through our humanity. Even Genesis 1:27 offers more ways to understand God's relation to gender than conservative readings allow. For example, as Rabbi Margaret Morris-Wennick points out, the phrase male and female can be read not as saying that these are the only ways God creates human beings, but as following parallel biblical phrases such as young and old, in being a merism, a rhetorical formula that includes an entire spectrum of possibilities by naming only its opposite poles. Even ancient rabbinic commentaries note that the Hebrew of Genesis 1:27 doesn't actually say male and female God created them, but literally says male and female God created him, which gave rise to a rabbinic tradition that holds that God created the first human as a hermaphrodite. I'm not offering these examples to argue against religious conservatives' ideas of gender. For reasons I'll soon explain, I see such arguments as making it harder to persuade conservatives to consider alternatives to anti-trans theologies. But as we develop these alternatives, it's important to remember that though conservative religious versions of gender do represent ancient understandings of Genesis 1:27, they don't represent the only ways to understand that verse, and that biblically based traditions have acknowledged for millennia that God doesn't only create human beings male and female, but other ways as well. And though conservative versions of binary gender have deep roots in religious tradition, anti-trans theologies don't. They are recently developed responses to the surge in acceptance of trans and non-binary identities in secular culture and in less conservative religious communities. The language of anti-trans theologies varies considerably depending on their tradition, sophistication, and the temperament of those who propound them, but they all defend conservative versions of gender by denying the reality of trans and non-binary identities. Though this denial is often accompanied by the kind of insults we see in Rabbi Tendler's outbursts, more recent and developed statements of anti-trans theology tend to avoid them, and some combine their calls for rejection of trans and non-binary identities with calls for compassion toward the people who live them. In short, it's a mistake to assume that all expressions of anti-trans theology are the same, or that everything they say reflects and can be reduced to the kind of reflexive transphobia that fuels Rabbi Tendler's rage. Nowadays, it's common for conservative leaders to present anti-trans theologies as natural, inevitable outgrowths of binary-based religious traditions. But that isn't true, as I learned when the Post reporter, a former student of mine, told me that Rabbi Tendler was the only New York area Orthodox Jewish leader willing to give anti-trans quotes to secular media. And while some Orthodox rabbis echoed Rabbi Tendler's condemnation, others criticized him for violating Jewish laws that require that all human beings be treated with compassion and spoken of with the respect due to anyone created in God's image. These reactions show that conservative religious traditions allow for other responses to trans and non-binary identities than those urged by anti-trans theologies. There's an ancient tradition of homophobia in Judaism, alas, but before the publicity surrounding my transition, Orthodox Judaism had little awareness of, and so no tradition of condemning trans and non-binary people. A prominent trans evangelical preacher told me that in the early 21st century, this was also the case in many conservative evangelical communities. When she came out at her Texas megachurch, she said she was supported by her colleagues and continued to preach for years until the rise of anti-trans theology led to her being shunned by her community. And contrary to Rabbi Tendler's insistence that transsexuality in the Torah is absolutely forbidden, even Numbers 22:5, which famously says, "A woman must not put on man's apparel, nor shall a man wear women's clothing, for whoever does these things is abhorrent to your God," doesn't forbid transsexuality or other gender identities. Like other texts in the Hebrew Bible, it focuses purely on bodies and behavior, without considering how the individuals wearing this or that piece of clothing identify in terms of gender. In fact, before 20th century publicity surrounding gender transition made Orthodox rabbis aware of folks like me, Jewish tradition interpreted this law as prohibiting not transsexuality, which they'd never heard of, but fraud, cross-dressing to gain some benefit, generally forbidden heterosexual relations, that would be out of reach if one's physical sex were known. While there have always been people, indeed entire cultures, who don't accept the assumption that every human being is either male or female, the concept of a gender identity distinct from biological sex only started to develop toward the end of the 19th century. As a result, older religious traditions have little to say about how to understand and respond to people who embrace trans and non-binary identities. This silence allows for a wide range of responses to us, from militant anti-trans theology to the insistence of Orthodox rabbis that regardless of my gender, Judaism still saw me as a human being who should be treated with respect, to the supportive emails I got from students after my transition, including one that said, "My tradition tells me nothing about how to understand your gender, but it tells me a lot about how to respond to human suffering, and I know you must be in a lot of pain to do what you're doing." My dean's initial responses to the coming out letter I sent her also showed the range of possibilities allowed by Orthodox tradition. She met with me personally and assured me that I would continue to be a valued faculty member and receive full salary and benefits, but also told me it was against university policy for, quotes, "a physically male person to set foot on campus in women's clothing." I think the dean was as surprised as I was when banning me from campus offended some of the very students she believed would demand it. In fact, one self-described extremely conservative student told me that she planned to protest to the dean in person until the ban was reversed, because she believed an institution representing Orthodox Judaism shouldn't treat a human being that way. I don't know what my students said, but despite my dean's prediction that it would be generations before Orthodox students and their parents would accept a teacher like me, the university allowed me to return to teaching less than a year after I was banned from campus. My return didn't mean that the university had committed to trans and non-binary inclusion. They let me return without publicly acknowledging the validity of my trans or female identities, rejected requests from students and staffs for workshops on gender diversity, and promoted a don't ask, don't tell approach that made it uncomfortable for anyone, including my colleagues in our extremely secular English department, to talk about or even refer to my transition. At the same time, though, the university quietly changed my gender in human resources databases and on paychecks, changed my name on my office door, referred to me respectfully and with she, her pronouns, and granted my application for early promotion to full professor. And though they insisted as a condition of my return that I only use single stall bathrooms, they said nothing when, after a couple of years, I started using the women's room near my office. I knew that I had finally broken through that barrier when I accidentally ran into the dean in the women's room one time. And she also just said, "Oh, hi, Joy." The silence surrounding my transition in gender was uncomfortable for all concerned, but the university's responses, and those of many students and Orthodox rabbis, show that religious conservatives can accept the presence of people like me without either compromising their allegiance to binary gender or, as anti-trans theologies demand, actively rejecting our identities. They also show that religious conservatives can read binary based texts and traditions as summoning them to look past the questions raised by trans and non-binary identities, and to focus instead on what Genesis 1:27 repeats 3 times and teaches is behind all genders, the image of God in which humanity is created. In the 15 years since I came out, the cultural, political, and religious situation has changed in ways that make it harder for religious conservatives to respond to trans and non-binary people as my students in university did. Then there was far less awareness of us, fewer inclusion efforts, and far less progress in terms of rights and education, and thus far less backlash against us. Expressions of anti-trans theology tended to be phobic outbursts like Rabbi Tendler's, rather than the formal, thought-out efforts to shape conservative understanding we see today, leaving space for religious conservatives to reach their own conclusions about how to respond to the comparatively few people who are publicly embracing trans or non-binary identities. That space, unfortunately, has now been filled. The success of inclusion efforts has paradoxically made it harder for many religious conservatives to accept trans and non-binary identities. That's partly because these successes have made our identities a target for conservative media and politicians. But it's also because by highlighting the changes required to include people who don't fit binary gender categories, inclusion efforts have helped conservatives understand the conflicts between trans and non-binary identities and binary gender in ways that Rabbi Tendler, my students in Yeshiva University couldn't. In fact, recent statements of anti-trans theology use language and concepts taken from inclusion efforts to support their arguments that trans and non-binary identities are inherently incompatible with conservative versions of binary gender. These arguments work to inoculate conservatives against inclusion efforts by framing them as threats to conservative religious traditions and ways of life, rather than attempts to help a vulnerable minority share in the blessings religious traditions offer. The spread of anti-trans theologies means we can't base the alternatives to them on language and concepts that have become staples of inclusion efforts. Instead, I suggest that we begin developing these alternatives by understanding the conflicts highlighted by anti-trans theologies, to see which are most troubling to religious conservatives so that we can speak persuasively to them. For those who support inclusion, it can be hard to read statements of anti-trans theology at all, and even harder to look past the transphobia and recycled talking points and focus on how they can help us understand the concerns of religious conservatives. But we can't ask for understanding from those we don't try to understand, or empathy from those we refuse to empathize with, or compassion from those we condemn, or respect for what our forms of gender mean to us, without showing we know how much others' forms of gender mean to them. But there's more at stake in understanding anti-trans theologies than basic fairness and strategic insights. Although people on all sides of the gender wars fear that the conflicts between binary gender and trans identities are so great that only one or the other can survive, the truth is that families, communities, and cultures have always done gender in a variety of ways, and for the foreseeable future, both binary and other forms will continue. This means that whatever version of gender we embrace, we all need to learn with those who understand gender in ways we find wrong, offensive, or dangerous, ways that don't include us, or only include us if we're willing to pretend to be other than who we know ourselves to be. To live and encourage religious conservatives to accept living in a world that includes many ways of doing gender, we need to reckon with how our versions of gender seem to those whose versions are incompatible with ours, so that we can compassionately respond to the conflicts that arise between us. Fortunately for us, these days, anti-trans theologians have a lot to say about how the ideas of gender and identity implied by trans and non-binary identities conflict with conservative versions of gender. In fact, critiques of what anti-trans activists often call the ideology of these identities have become standard, lengthy parts of formal statements of anti-trans theology. For example, take this quotation. Screen share that again. I'll be referring to this for a while. Take this quotation from Pope Francis, featured in the Vatican's 2019 teaching, Male and Female, He Created Them, Towards a Path of Dialogue on the Question of Gender in Education, which asserts that the ideology implied by trans and non-binary identities denies the difference in reciprocity in the nature of a man and a woman, and envisages a society without sexual differences, thereby eliminating the anthropological basis of the family. This ideology leads to educational programs and legislative enactments that promote a personal identity and emotional intimacy radically separated from the biological difference between male and female. Consequently, human identity becomes the choice of the individual, one which can also change over time. Now, that is obviously a vast improvement over Rabbi Tendler, right? We have made progress in some ways here. But to those who favor inclusion, Francis's claims probably sound far-fetched. After all, even though my female gender identification is not connected to, quotes, the biological difference between male and female, there's no sign that when they refer to me with she, her pronouns, my Yeshiva University colleagues eliminated the anthropological basis of their families. But Francis is right that by denying that gender identity is determined by biological maleness or femaleness, trans and non-binary identities undermine the basis of binary gender, which means that he and other anti-trans theologians are right to wonder how accepting the validity of these identities will affect binary-based relationships, communities, and ways of life. Though anti-trans critiques like these point toward the conflicts that make trans and non-binary identities so troubling to religious conservatives, they tend to do so by describing consequences they fear rather than naming or detailing the conflicts themselves, which means that to understand the conflicts, we have to reverse engineer and work backward from anti-trans catastrophizing. For example, when Francis worries that trans and non-binary identities deny the difference in reciprocity in the nature of a man and woman and envisage a society without sexual differences, we need to recognize that he's highlighting the fundamental conflict between the binary belief that gender is determined by individuals' physical sex and the belief that underlies trans and non-binary identities, that gender is determined by how individuals understand ourselves. Francis is wrong that all, or probably even most, who favor inclusion envisage a society without sexual differences. But he's right that because trans and non-binary identities reject physical sex as the basis for gender, they deny the significance that binary gender gives to sexual differences. That includes denying that people with male and female bodies have inherently different natures, abilities, needs, and desires, and that these differences are reciprocal, or, as many conservatives put it, complementary, in ways that make heterosexual marriage, femininity and masculinity, and male and female gender roles consequences of biology rather than culture. In other words, according to trans and non-binary identities, we are not born this way. We don't have to, having a male or female body doesn't have these consequences for how you identify, but also how you behave or relate to others. As Francis highlights, one of conservatives' major concerns is that by denying that physical sex defines gender, trans and non-binary identities transform gender from a fixed characteristic that offers a stable foundation for family and other relationships into something that can change over time. To me, the idea that my gender identity, my sense of who I truly am in terms of gender, is merely a personal choice because it's not determined by biology seems both wrong-headed and insulting. But Francis is right that trans and non-binary identities, far more than sex-based binary identities, are liable to change over time. For example, though I've always identified as female as long as I can remember, I lived as a male for 46 years before starting to live as a woman. As a very young child, I thought of myself as really a girl, but I started to understand myself as a male to female transsexual a few years later when I read that now terribly old-fashioned term in a magazine. I only began identifying as transgender, a term that unites many otherwise different identities that don't conform to binary gender, after my transition. In other words, the ways I've understood and identified myself and my female gender identification have changed as I and my culture grew more sophisticated about gender. Of course, trans and non-binary identities aren't the only ones that change as individuals and cultures change. The way those who embrace binary gender understand and live what it means to be a male or female changes too. But however startling some of those changes may seem, binary gender assures us that individuals remain the males or females, men or women, their bodies define them as being. By contrast, because trans and non-binary identities are self-determined rather than assigned at birth, they remind us that however individuals have previously presented ourselves, we can't be sure how we may identify in the future. For Francis and others accustomed to the predictability of binary identities, accepting that gender is self-determined, as trans and non-binary identities require, destabilizes all relationships that have traditionally been based on gender. When we read them this way, we see that the fear that underlies all of Francis's claims, the fear that driving the spread of anti-trans theologies, is that trans and non-binary identities conflict so profoundly with binary gender that it's impossible to recognize them without destroying binary-based identities and ways of life. Many people, from religious conservatives to anti-trans feminists, see this fear coming true when binary terms such as women are replaced by trans-inclusive terms such as people who menstruate. But there's no sign that educational programs and legislative enactments and other inclusion efforts pose imminent threats to binary gender. After all, even in families, institutions, and communities that accept trans and non-binary identities, most folks continue to embrace binary gender, identify with the genders they were assigned at birth, and form relationships on the basis of binary identities. But Francis is right that recognizing the validity of trans and non-binary identities changes gender for everyone. The long-term consequences of these changes are not yet clear. widespread recognition of trans and non-binary identities is, in civilizational terms, quite recent. But we can glimpse how profound these changes may be in one of the most widely adopted forms of recognition, the practice of declaring preferred pronouns. Traditional binary gender identities encourage us to think of each individual man and woman as essentially similar to all other he's and she's, and to believe that no matter how strange or changeable people may seem to us, we can always identify them as he or she on the basis of unchangeable physical characteristics and widely understood forms of gender expression, which means we rarely need to ask which pronoun they prefer. That's also why Shakespeare comedies have people changing genders as soon as they change clothes. Like when you live in a binary gender world, the way people look determines, you believe, how you can identify them in terms of gender. You don't need anything else. By contrast, trans and non-binary identities encourage us to see everyone as different, to believe individuals can only truly be known by themselves, and to accept that we should identify others not by how they look, dress, sound, or act, but by how, at any given moment, they explicitly identify themselves. These ideas of gender and identity are institutionalized by the practice of having each person state their preferred pronouns on name tags and signature blocks and at the start of group events. This practice encourages us to see everyone's gender as self-determined, including those who have always identified with the gender they were assigned at birth, and to express those identities through conventional forms of gender expression. Because the pronoun declaration practice renders these ways of recognizing and expressing binary identities meaningless. No matter how traditionally binary our gender expression may be, we can't be identified as male or female until we declare those identities. And because, as Francis notes, self-determined identities can change over time, when the practice of declaring pronouns is institutionalized, even folks who have always embraced binary gender identities have to constantly reaffirm their he-ness and she-ness, which is why non-trans allies often include their pronouns in signature blocks, bios, and so on. In short, while inclusion efforts don't erase or prevent people from embracing binary identities, the practice of pronoun declaration shows that Francis is right to suggest that promoting trans-centered ideas of gender and identity destabilizes binary gender by denying the assumptions on which it's founded. And he's right that recognizing trans and non-binary identities may change relationships, institutions, communities, and religious traditions based on binary gender. The questions raised by conflicts between different ways of doing gender aren't only of concern to people who embrace binary gender. They concern everyone who has a stake in gender, which is to say, almost everyone. Most of us depend on gender to help us understand and express, and to enable others to recognize who we know ourselves to be. Most of us want others to relate to us in ways that reflect the gender identities we embrace, and know how hurtful it can be when others see us in ways that deny or contradict how we see ourselves. When gender works for us, it helps us feel recognized, known, and understood, which means that whatever form of gender we embrace, Francis is right to suggest that we depend on gender not just to show who we are as individuals, but to foster emotional intimacy, family, community, belonging. And that's why so many of us react so fiercely when our forms of gender are threatened. We fear that if we lose them, we lose the possibility of living and loving as who we are. Although Pope Francis is a religious leader, his critique, like most critiques of gender ideology, isn't explicitly religious. But in the context of anti-trans theology, even non-religious critiques have religious implications, implications spelled out in evangelical author Sharon James' essay, Relativism and Embodied Truth, in which she frames the rejection of binary identities assigned on the basis of God-given bodies in favor of self-determined trans and non-binary identities as an extension of the Enlightenment's rejection of religion as a source of truth in favor of individuals making our own secular sense of reality. And if you are looking for really unsubtle versions of anti-trans theology, I can't recommend Sharon James too highly. It is unvarnished. Whether or not they mention the Enlightenment, the idea that trans and non-binary identities are inherently secular and anti-religious is so central to anti-trans theologies that they ignore any evidence that suggests that these identities can be consistent with devotion to God and religious tradition. The refusal of anti-trans theologians to engage with inclusive theologies and the work of trans and non-binary religious leaders is frustrating, but it also offers hope, because it suggests that they fear that if conservatives see that trans and non-binary identities aren't inherently anti-religious, they might be open to less hostile ways of understanding them. But if the alternatives we offer to anti-trans theologies are to speak persuasively to conservatives, they must not only counter the idea that these identities are anti-religious, they also have to reckon with the theological conflicts highlighted by statements such as these. From the 2023 Southern Baptist Convention resolution on opposing gender transition. So this is the state of the anti-trans theological art. Whereas the Bible declares that God created humans in his own image as distinctly male and female, and whereas the Bible teaches that the differences between men and women are complementary, determined at conception, immutable, rooted in God's design, and most clearly revealed in bodily differences, not in self-defined and ultimately false notions of gender identity, whereas God's holy and good design for two distinct and complementary sexes is rooted in the creative order and serves as the foundation for all societal cooperation and structures. As you can see from this example, most of the religious language we find in statements of anti-trans theology is quite familiar. I mean, this is 2023, but it could have been 2013. These things have not changed very much. They're a remix of biblical references. Gender 127 is a constant, and creeds that have long been deployed to promote patriarchy, disparage feminism, and more recently to oppose gay rights and same-sex marriage. The particulars vary depending on author, context, and religious tradition. But statements of anti-trans theology always affirm that binary gender is sacred and was built into humanity when God created human beings, male and female. Even in these terse paragraphs, the implied conflicts between this belief and trans and non-binary identities are clear. Because trans and non-binary identities reject divinely created maleness and femaleness, they're false notions invented by human beings rather than essential natures given by God. Because these identities are self-defined, they reject God's good and holy design for humanity and God's will for the individuals who embrace them. Because only binary gender reflects the creation of humanity in God's image, trans and non-binary identities reject the divine human relationship. And because binary gender is the divinely established foundation for all societal cooperation and structures, identities that conflict with it endanger any religious community that accepts them. Transphobic though they are, these implications also reflect real theological problems and questions that trans and non-binary identities raise for religious conservatives. And to be persuasive, alternatives to anti-trans theologies have to address them. How, if at all, do these identities reflect the divine human relationship in the image of God? How can those who see binary identities as ordained and assigned by God understand self-determined gender identities as other than expressions of secular, anti-religious individualism? And how can conservative religious communities respect the identities trans and non-binary folks embrace without betraying their own binary-based traditions and practices? The difficulty of such questions can make it hard to hope or even imagine that religious conservatives will pay attention to our answers to them. But as I've suggested, the very refusal of anti-trans theology to acknowledge religious arguments for inclusion gives me hope that conservatives might be open to answers phrased in language that speaks to them. I also see hope in the fact that anti-trans theologians who present trans and non-binary identities as threats to religious tradition often also include reminders that those traditions summon conservatives to treat trans and non-binary people with love rather than fear, as we see in this excerpt from the Southern Baptist Convention's earlier 2014 resolution on transgender identity. Resolve that we extend love and compassion to those whose sexual self-understanding is shaped by a distressing conflict between their biological sex and their gender identity. And be it further resolved that we invite all transgender persons to trust in Christ and to experience renewal in the gospel. And be it further resolved that we love our transgender neighbors, seek their good always, welcome them to our churches, and as they repent and believe in Christ, receive them into church membership. And be it further resolved that we regard our transgender neighbors as image bearers of Almighty God and therefore condemn acts of abuse or bullying committed against them. These resolutions highlight the fact that religious texts and traditions conservatives embrace call for people who don't fit binary categories to be seen as human beings created by God in God's image. Human beings conservatives should welcome, protect, sympathize with, treat as neighbors, and love. Such affirmations seem hypocritical at best in the context of statements denying the reality of trans and non-binary identities, and that present them as rejections of God and religion, and oppose treatments that have been shown to help those experiencing identity or body-related distress. But even if they represent nothing more than cynical attempts to preempt inclusive theologies that say similar things by suggesting that loving our transgender neighbors is somehow consistent with virulent rejection of trans and non-binary identities, these calls for compassion offer hope that religious conservatives may be open to alternatives to anti-trans theologies. For one thing, these calls show that anti-trans theologians know, and know their fellow believers know, that religious tradition allows for a variety of responses to trans and non-binary identities. For another, they suggest that anti-trans theologians fear that despite their success in demonizing trans and non-binary identities, parts of religious tradition that call for love rather than hate speak too powerfully to religious conservatives to ignore. Moreover, by calling for compassion for the distressing conflict between biological sex and their gender identity, for the distressing conflict experienced by trans and non-binary people, they acknowledge and summon conservatives to acknowledge the reality of gender dysphoria, the fact that for many trans and non-binary people, the difference between biological sex and individual gender identity isn't a matter of ideology, but anguish. Even in the more militant 2023 resolution, which limits such affirmations to a single concluding sentence, they show that even anti-trans theologians can and do accept that trans and non-binary identities are real to those who embrace them, that not living those identities causes suffering and harm, that those of us who belong to conservative religious communities are targeted for bullying and abuse, and that however problematic our identities may seem, we too are created in God's image. These calls also highlight a source of hope that anti-trans theologies otherwise work hard to deny. They show that they know that there are religious trans and non-binary people who, like conservatives, care deeply about God, religious tradition, and community. If religious conservatives pay attention to our lives and writing, they will find that many of us join them in seeing our gender identities as reflecting both God's design for humanity and God's will for us as individuals. For us, as for them, living these identities is essential for creating authentic, loving relationships and families, and for being the people God created us to be. While it's important to recognize signs of hope and common ground in anti-trans theologies, how, in a practical sense, can we use what we learn from them to develop alternatives that speak persuasively to the concerns trans and non-binary identities raised for religious conservatives? There's no one answer to this question. We'll each take our own lessons from anti-trans theologies and develop alternatives that reflect our own experiences, identities, situations, and religious traditions, as well as those of the communities we're addressing. So instead of pretending to know what you should do, I'll conclude by summarizing the most important things I've learned from anti-trans theologies and sketch out 2 alternatives I've developed that show how I've applied these insights. For me, the most important insight is that anti-trans theologies grow out of a single underlying fear. The fear that conflicts between trans and non-binary identities and conservative versions of gender are so great that even acknowledging the validity of these identities would undermine binary gender and the religious traditions and ways of life based upon it. These conflicts, the conflicts that give rise to this fear are real, as I've indicated, and our alternatives must address them. But anti-trans theologians magnify concerns about how inclusion efforts may affect binary gender and religious tradition by portraying fears as rapidly encroaching realities that can only be resisted by rejecting trans and non-binary identities. To me, this makes it essential that the alternatives I offer avoid inadvertently confirming or feeding the fears that anti-trans theology span, and that I combat them by offering concrete examples of how trans and non-binary identities can coexist with and be understood in terms that religious conservatives accept. It also suggests that as I address specific conflicts between our ways of doing gender, I have to do so in ways that make it clear that I understand, because I share, the needs that make gender so important to them, and that I'm committed to managing these conflicts in ways that enable all of us to meet these needs. Even if they do little more, alternatives that follow these guidelines can demonstrate that anti-trans theologians are wrong to insist that trans and non-binary identities pose an existential threat. They can show that rather than seeking to destroy or erase binary identities and traditions, we're inviting religious conservatives to join us in creating a world in which conflicts between our ways of doing gender can be managed so that both, however uneasily, can coexist. While all of us should aim for better, even achieving this kind of uneasy tolerance would be a vast improvement on the hatred, fear, and violence promoted by anti-trans theologies. But we can also use the insights we glean from anti-trans theologies to develop more specific alternatives to them, as I hope the following examples will show. Both the alternatives I've developed are rooted in Orthodox teachings from my own Jewish tradition and phrased in terms of biblically rooted religious concepts, miracles, and welcoming the stranger that are widely accepted by religious conservatives. Each alternative acknowledges and addresses a different problem trans and non-binary identities raise for conservatives. Both offer ways of responding to that problem that are consistent with binary-based traditions, and both show that trans and non-binary identities can be understood in ways that affirm rather than reject the divine human relationship. The first alternative is a response to a problem raised by the explicitly theological parts of anti-trans theology. The fact that conservative religious versions of gender don't offer a way of understanding trans and non-binary identities as divinely created. I begin by invoking the miracles portrayed in the Bible, events incomprehensible in terms of human understanding of the natural order, but whose very incomprehensibility makes them signs of God's will and presence. Jewish tradition sees miracles not as deviations from the divine order of creation, but as built-in exceptions to it, separately created by God in the final hour of the 6th day of creation. Because I, like religious conservatives, see all human beings as created by God, I suggest that they can understand trans and non-binary identities the same way they understand miracles such as the biblical Sarah becoming pregnant and giving birth to Isaac in her 90s, as divinely created exceptions to what they see as the natural binary gender order, exceptions which, precisely because they don't make sense in terms of that order, reflect God's incomprehensible will and presence in human lives. My second example turns to the question of how conservative religious communities can include trans and non-binary people without either denying our identities or betraying their belief in binary gender by accepting them. I begin by noting that this question arises because these communities identify their members in terms of binary identities, which makes trans and non-binary identities seem so strange that it's hard for other community members to identify and include those who embrace them. I then suggest that communities respond to this problem by remembering the dozens of biblical commandments that summon us to include the stranger, the ger in Hebrew, which in context means what we now call resident aliens, people who call a given community home, but who are different in ways that mean they will always be seen as strangers. These biblical injunctions make it clear that God expects religious communities to include such strangers and demands that they not only be treated justly and compassionately, but be included equally in religious rites and observances, and be seen as integral to the moral, ethical, and spiritual well-being of the community. These injunctions also prompt us to see the strangeness of strangers as a matter of situation rather than essence, repeating again and again that the Israelites who see others as strangers were themselves treated as strangers in the land of Egypt. These injunctions remind us that no matter how well we may fit into a given community, we all know how it feels to be seen as too different to belong. I then suggest that God's peculiar insistence on how we treat strangers reflects the fact that God is the ultimate stranger, too incomprehensibly different to fit gender or any other human roles and categories, which means that communities that can't include someone who doesn't fit binary gender can't include God. I conclude by suggesting that conservative religious communities embrace the challenges of including trans and non-binary people they see as strange, not only to fulfill God's will regarding the treatment of strangers, but to show that their communities are places where God can dwell. As I hope these examples demonstrate, we can craft alternatives to anti-trans theologies that respond to the conflicts and fears they highlight in ways that speak from and to conservatives' religious traditions, and show them how these very traditions can help them understand trans and non-binary identities as signs of and opportunities to welcome God's incomprehensible presence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ladin, for a very stimulating lecture. I'm trying to move here. So, okay, is that better? All right, so we want to take the time to have a period where we can ask Dr. Ladin some questions. She's agreed to hang around for a little bit so we can ask some questions of her. But even before we open it up for questions, I would just like to just kind of the lecture was stimulating in many ways. Your last point, calling for conservative communities to lean into the practice and the admonition to welcome the stranger. Can you talk about that even a little bit more? And then we can open up for questions.
Yes, thank you. And I know that was a lot. I know it was too much. I basically figured I got 45 minutes with you. I want to jam in as much as I can. So I get that, that was too much. That alternative actually grows out of my own experience. I, as long as I can remember, I was trans, but I survived living as a trans kid in hiding because I had such an intense sense of God's presence and such a foundational relationship with God. And my family was secular. This is not something that other people shared. And because they were secular, nobody told me that I was wrong, that God would never hang around with a kid like me. And so for me, when I was hanging around with God, I felt close to God because neither of us fit gender categories. I felt like God is a fellow disembodied being. It's not that I didn't have a body, but my body didn't show other people who I was. It didn't even show people that I was there. And I could see from my secular family that God's lack of a body to show that God is there was a big obstacle. to people recognizing the presence of God, which for me was like, how can you not see this? But it was obvious that it was easy for them. And, God knew who I was. And I felt like this is my sort of private covenant with God, that God is bearing witness to me. And so I have to bear witness to God. And the specific witness that I felt like I had to bear was to be true to God's incomprehensibility. The fact that God was utterly beyond what human beings could understand. Now, when I was a kid, I had a childish, narcissistic version of this. It was very flattering to think that God and I were like this. God was a little taller, but basically we're the same. God wants to hang around with me. We have the same social problems. To some extent, we did have the same social problems. And I think that I'm right saying that a community that has no place for folks who are really different, and who seem strange, really doesn't have a place for the divine presence, because it's really different and really strange. So, and scary. We know that, right? Anything can happen. So that's where this comes from for me. And I elaborated in my book, The Soul of the Stranger. But it wasn't until I was an adult and really writing that book that I was struck by how stuck on this stranger thing God is. God is so stuck on this that literally during the Exodus, like the firstborn have just been killed, the Israelites have just jumped up from their Seder tables and they're streaming out through the wilderness, and they got no idea what's going on. They got a pillar of fire in front of them. It must have been absolute insanity. God says to Moses, I think both Moses and Aaron, by the way, later on, when you're established in the land and you're celebrating Passover, make sure that you make provision for the stranger to celebrate Passover with you. Now, Passover in Jewish tradition, I mean, the first Passover is like a brutally binary celebration of Israelite identity. You either splash your lintel with blood, which says you're a Jew, or you don't, which means you're the angel of death is going to be paying your family a visit, right? It's either one or the other. But God says, make sure that people you see as too strange to see as one of us can offer the Passover sacrifice and join in that observance. There's a separate rule for foreigners that involves, whatever. But why? I mean, I can imagine how irritated Moses and Aaron must have been when God is bringing this up. It's like, could we at least get across the sea before we start figuring out how we're going to celebrate Passover in the Promised Land? But God doesn't actually want them to take another step without recognizing that when they celebrate Passover as free people, they have to make sure that they include people that they see as too different to belong, people they see as strange. I'm sorry, I don't know if that answered your question.
Oh, wait, I think so. And it caused me to have more. Thank you. I appreciate that. So let's open up for questions. Anybody have questions for Dr. Lee?
And I would just like to say, please don't hesitate or worry about terminology or saying certain things or not saying certain things. I think it is so crucial because we are all stakeholders in gender, right? Like if there's a problem or conflict at your school, everybody needs to be able to speak freely about it and share their mind respectfully, but you need to say what your feeling is, because otherwise there's no way to really work out solutions together. And we need to be able to have those conversations about gender. So please don't worry about hurting my feelings or saying the wrong thing.
Maybe Andrew?
I don't want to look like I'm asking a question now, trying to hurt your feelings. So, Dr. Ladin, great. I'm with Dean Mumford, a lot to think about. I'm more curious though of how you've been received. Speaking to our seminary right now, generally we're very eager and want to be engaged in this conversation in a very peaceful, non-antagonistic sort of way. I'm guessing, have you been invited into less inviting places? Truly, have you been invited into those conservative religious places And what types of questions arise in this type of a moment? What pops up?
You know, this is one of the great failures of my life, I would say. But after the 2016 election, I raised money so that I could go to really conservative transphobic communities and for free. They wouldn't have to pay for me. And because I knew that a lot of people were angry precisely at people like me, you know, East Coast, intellectual, academic, trans and non-binary identity promoting, you know, folks. And I thought, you know, they need someone like me to just show up and listen to what gender means for them. And if they want to ask me questions about what gender means to me, that's fine. But I've learned, one thing I've learned as a trans person is that while not everybody by a long shot is interested in understanding me, everyone I've ever met is interested in being understood by others. We crave being understood by others. So that's a gift that I can give them. And that giving that gift is a way to try to shift the dynamic. So I sent out letters. You know, I did everything that I asked friends to refer me to people. I did everything I could basically to get folks who hate me to invite me to come to their communities to speak to them. And shockingly, there were not any people who hate trans people who wanted a trans person to come and speak to their community. The closest I came was there was a pastor who knew about me because he was a poet. He just finished his MFA. He knew about me as a poet, and we were corresponding. And he said he ran a small trailer park. You know, he had a church there, and he'd like me to come there. And I said, "Oh, awesome! I'm coming." And then he wrote a little later and said, "I'm sorry, I've just been fired."
Wow.
Yeah. So I have been, I mean, I still think it's a good idea, but I've just been a failure in doing that. And now I can't come physically. And I do think that the physical experience of being listened to is important. But I would say to you, if you or anyone you know knows conservative groups, however small, that would like me to listen, talk, I am happy to do it, and I'm happy to do it for free. The closest that I've come, well, there's being at Yeshiva University, but because of the don't ask, don't tell policy, that was a buffer that really prevented us from having hard conversations. I am pretty sure that some of my students looked at me and interpreted my gender as meaning I was sexually perverted. And I think some looked at me, and I mean, I know that some students told me their rabbis had told them that I was mentally ill. And others looked at me and said, you know, there's a man wearing a dress that's not the right size or whatever, you know, but because they treated me with absolute respect, I had a glimpse of how they felt about my gender. And I had to learn that actually my sense of myself could survive being in a place where nobody was confirming it, as long as they weren't trashing it. Right. So that was a crucial understanding. And it's one that I think, because trans people are so embattled and we are often so battered and bruised, and also when we start living our identities, I mean, think about how hungry children are to have you look at them and hear what they're saying and see them the way that they want to be seen. We're like that too. When we're first living as ourselves, we've literally been starved our whole lives to have other people see us the way we see ourselves. It's like a physical need. However, it's not a physical need. And we can survive in that. And I think that Yeshiva University was also, that was a bridge too far for them. They could not issue a statement that they were committed to gender diversity. In fact, they weren't committed to any form of diversity that I'm aware of. This was the best that they could do. And from my perspective, the best that they could do is a whole lot better than what we see happening now. And it's a whole lot better than what anti-trans theologies are urging. And maybe I'm a starry-eyed optimist, but I feel like when folks realize that they can live together and treat one another with respect, then more becomes possible. More kinds of understanding become possible. But I'm really committed to gender diversity in this, as I hope came across. I don't want a world where everybody does gender my way. I want a world where everybody gets to do the gender the way that is true and authentic for them, and the way that enables them to flourish. And that includes people who will always see me as a very, very troubled man, as opposed to the way that I see myself. So the one opportunity I had was this summer, an Orthodox Jewish community in St. Louis, which is the epicenter for a lot of this, asked me to come and talk to them. The rabbi was part of a series he was doing, and people listened. And I was doing a different talk where I was showing how Jewish identity, which is weird and complicated, can help Orthodox Jews understand the weird complications of trans and non-binary identities. And then when I was finished, this woman spoke up at length and with incredible heartbreak about how she did not understand trans and non-binary identities at all. When her son's best friend, he's like 7, came out to him, said, "Oh, I used to be a girl," but this was like after they'd known each other for a couple of years. Her son was confused and upset, and she didn't know what to tell her son. Why wasn't anybody talking about how this related to the Torah? She said, "I thought we were the Jewish tradition. There's a principle of building a fence around the Torah, the way you build a fence around a parapet on your house. You don't want people to fall off. So you not only do what God tells you to do, but you do a little bit more just to make sure that you don't accidentally fall off the roof." She's like, "Why aren't we talking about how protecting the Torah? Doesn't the Torah tell us how we're supposed to be doing gender?" And I thought that all of those that's what I said. I didn't have answers for her, but I wanted the community to know that I thought that all of those were authentic and urgent questions, and that I think inclusion efforts make a mistake when we institutionalize the idea that either everybody thinks about gender the same way, or most people who don't are doing it wrong. That really mirroring what you see in gender conservative communities, right? There's one right way of doing gender, and everybody who doesn't do it is wrong. And I think that even like my family was, I would say, hallucinatorily binary. I mean, my mother and my father, they had made themselves so different from each other that it was weird. Like my mother couldn't find the extension cords in the house she'd lived in for 20 years after my father died, because electrical things were a guy thing. So she didn't know. She couldn't know, as far as she was concerned. Other families were not like this. There are other ways to do binary gender in the 60s and 70s, other than the bizarre stuff that my parents were doing. So no matter how binary your community is, there are people who are doing gender in different ways all around you. We know how to live in this kind of a world. We can access that resilience and understanding. I got 2 questions here. How does the approach you're advocating for gender differ from previous approaches to those for non-allosexual identities? How is it similar? That is a big question, and I suspect there are some people who are hoping I really won't try to answer it at length. So I'm going to say that there are 2 big differences, Charlie. One is that I want to encourage people to see trans and non-binary identities not as a special thing, like everybody does gender one way, and then there's this other group, and we have to treat them very specially and differently. And they're different from one another. I mean, it's like incredible how many different trans and non-binary identities there are. So instead of thinking of it that way, which is the way I see people talking mostly, and instead of talking as though there's an absolute difference between trans and non-binary people and what we call cisgender people, which is not a term I use because I don't think anybody perfectly fits male and female gender roles, because we're created in the image of God, which means that all of us have to be more than what human categories say we are. That's what it means to be created in the image of God. We, like God, are always more. When we cut ourselves down to fit human categories, we're in pain. So I don't see there as being differences. What I see is people who need gender for profound social, emotional, and relational reasons. All of us who do gender seriously, the needs are basically the same. The ways we can fulfill those needs are quite different. But the ways that we do gender matter pretty much as much the same amount to each of us. Our lives depend on them. And when those ways of doing gender are the basis for communities, our communities depend on them. So a lot is at stake at this. So I think it's too big an ask to ask people to give up their way of doing gender just so that I can be comfortable in my way of doing gender. Instead, I want to look us to think about what are the problems that arise between our ways of doing gender, and how can we manage those conflicts, those problems, the way we manage other problems? Through compromise, working around them, taking turns. There are a whole bunch of ways to do it. Avoidance and denial at Yeshiva University and in my family, avoidance and denial were very effective conflict management strategies. They're not ideal, but you can keep the peace with them. So the other thing is, I think that we need a neutral language for talking about ways of doing gender that doesn't assume the rightness of any one way of doing gender, so that we can talk about these conflicts without betraying ourselves or stigmatizing one another. So those are two ways my approach is different. There's another question from Callan. How do we identify the chance for conversations of difference of gender from spaces that can become unsafe for us in this current climate? Callan, I'm not positive I understand that question. How do we identify the chance for conversations of difference of gender? I'm going to guess that's about different ways of doing gender, perhaps, in spaces that can become, I'm not sure what that is. I will say that Callan is right, that there are places you just can't talk about this. And one of the things I would say is, for folks who are trying to intervene, you have to first lower the temperature. We have turned this into an existential conflict, both for trans and non-binary people, where our right to exist is threatened, and religious conservatives, their way of, doing gender and everything else is threatened. And we have to lower that temperature, because we can't, those spaces keep feeling that way. They're not safe for anybody to have these conversations. So if you're on the inclusion side, you need to see if you can do the work of making the gestures that will lower the temperature. For example, showing that you understand or are interested in understanding other people's ways of doing gender, instead of just launching in and criticizing them and saying how they should change. Opening space for other people to talk, even when they're not opening space for you to talk. Right? There are different ways we can try to shift the ground and show people that this is not a fight to the death, that this is really a conversation, and that it's a tough conversation, but everybody's going to come out alive afterward. And nobody's way of doing gender is going to be eliminated.
Thank you. You had a question?
You actually answered my question in that first response, so thank you.
Okay.
It was a very similar question.
Okay. Other questions? So I had one last one. I think you're very open and receptive, and I just wonder, so while religious conservatives on the one hand see this whole issue as a threat to their way of being, there may be some on the trans side who see accommodating or even having the conversation about gender, that may be a threat to their existence. So how do people who find this threatening for their very existence, how do they enter into this conversation?
That is a wonderful question, and I know I talk a lot, and I'm sorry about that, but I do. It's a problem, but let me try to be more focused. First of all, I don't go to parties I'm not invited to. There are some places, I mean, if you accept, and not, I don't speak for really anybody but myself, but if you accept that we live in a diverse world, where there are different cultures and different religious traditions, where people that disagree on fundamental things. I mean, I'm not sure the disagreement about gender is more fundamental than the disagreement between Jews, Christians, and Muslims about what the arc of sacred history is. How has God's relationship with humanity have changed, and what are the key moments in it? I mean, we don't agree about that at all. We've killed each other for centuries over those disagreements, but we've learned that we can live side by side with people. Now, if you can't tolerate, and there are people who really can't tolerate somebody else's religious ideas, it's a good idea to not show up at their religious services. Somebody who can't tolerate the way a community does gender, and the community has, and you're too vulnerable, or the community is too inflexible to allow for any kind of inclusion or anything that works for you, I think we have to leave. And that is awful. I mean, ideally, all of us would be able to be at home where we feel like home is. But I'm not you, but I've never lived in that world. I've always had spaces, not just about gender. I mean, gender, of course, forget about it. I don't know where the place is that I'm at home there, but even apart from gender, you know, there are Jewish communities where I feel like I should be more comfortable. I remember I was outraged as a child. The first time I went to a different synagogue for services, and they didn't sing what I considered the right melodies. I'd never heard other prayer melodies. And thank God I didn't shout about it, but I was furious. They were doing it wrong, right? So we don't get to live in a world that accommodates all of our needs. And sometimes that is heartbreaking. Some of us, trans and non-binary people, many of us have had to leave families where we really should not have had to leave. But the truth is, the folks in those families are never going to accept us. So we can stay and get beaten up, and they can do horrible things to us, and we can do horrible things back, or we can give them space and be sad and move on and make lives elsewhere. So I envision a world where I don't think we can ask other people to make space in their communities from our ways of doing gender if we're not willing to live in a world where they get to do gender in their own ways. And so ultimately, that means that I, as a trans person, have to develop the resilience to live in a world where I know a lot of folks are not going to see me the way I see myself. That's just the truth of it. And it's easy for me to say, you know, I'm white, I'm middle class, I've got a stable place to live, I've got all of these ways in which society is not beating me down and kicking me. So it's relatively easy for me to say, well, I have the resilience to live in this world, and I live in a blue state, in the bluest part of the bluest state of New York, right? So I'm not saying that everybody can feel this way. I don't think so. I think I lucked out, and to some extent I'm benefiting from, you know, systemic injustice in having this. But I also think that this is the world that human beings have always lived in. And we always have the same basic choices. We can learn to live with one another. We can move away from one another, the way they did after the Tower of Babel, right? The languages of binary gender and trans and non-binary identities are so different that if you can only speak yours, you kind of have to go and live apart from each other, right? The way they did after the Tower of Babel confusion of languages. Or we can develop the resilience to know that, the folks that I'm talking to are never going to really see me the way I see myself. And that's sad, and it can feel lonely. It sure felt lonely in the classrooms at Yeshiva University. But on the other hand, we really got the joy of learning together and growing together. There were forms of communication and intimacy and understanding that we could share. We could be blessings for one another in some ways, even though we couldn't be blessings for one another in all ways.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ladin. Let's thank her for.
Thank you.
So much, giving us much to think about and to do as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
What you want to do with Benedict?
I can, you're up there.
All right, so we are thankful for all of you who joined us here on campus and those who joined us online for this stimulating lecture. So thank you so much. We hope that we are able to take this and not just think about it, but think about and talk about ways that we can put some of Dr. Ladin's words into actions. You had a question.
Is recording available?
Yes, so it will probably take a few days, but a recording will be available, and will we notify everyone who registered for the conference of the recording. Okay, so thank you so much, and let us do a benediction of prayer. Oh God, we are thankful for the time that you gave us to share together. May this not be the end, but indeed foster us a community, help us to foster a community that is more inclusive and more diverse, and help us take Dr. Ladin's suggestions out with us into the world to make the world a better place. All this we pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen.